Hello and welcome to this video tutorial on the Robinson R44 Raven 2 radio stack. Why this video tutorial? Well, with my solo coming up and not feeling totally adept at mastery of the radio stack, I called on one of my instructors who had done most of my training up until then to give me a total rundown on the radio stack. I figured that if for some reason I actually managed to get lost or even blown off course on my first solo, I knew that at least I'd be able to talk to somebody who'd get me back to the aerodrome. So this video tutorial was then conceptually born. So I hope that this tutorial will be of service to those pupil pilots wishing to brush up on their knowledge and use of the R44 Raven 2 radio stack, and also for any other R44 helicopter pilot wanting a handy radio stack knowledge review. I'd like to also bring your attention to the disclaimer that appears at the end of this video. Please do read it and be aware of its contents. So let's start with a quick rundown of the radio stack. What you're seeing on the screen right now is the standard Robinson R44 Raven 2 radio stack. Where do you find this? Well, you find it in here, but more specifically, you'll find it here at the lower part of the Raven 2's instrument panel. As I said, this is the standard radio stack that you'll find on the R44 Raven 2, and it comprises a number of different components. So first at the top we have the audio controller or audio control unit. Then below that we have radio 1. Below that again we have radio 2, which is actually part of the multifunction GPS unit. So radio 2 is incorporated in the GPS. And then finally below that we have the altitude encoder, which we don't particularly cover in this tutorial. We'll now be reviewing the three devices, i.e. the audio control unit, radio 1 and radio 2, which as I said is part of the GPS unit. Firstly, we'll review radio 1 on its own, then we'll have a look at radio 2, which is integrated into the GPS unit, and finally we'll have a look at the working use of the whole radio system by looking at how the audio control unit is used to manage your radio communications and the intercom system. You will obviously need to familiarize yourself with the relevant controls and display windows that you need to be accustomed with. So firstly, let's take a look at radio 1. Radio 1 has a number of important controls associated with it. So let's go through them one by one and have a look at what you have available to you. Firstly, we have on the top left-hand corner a built-in photocell for automatic dimming. This will simply just dim the display or brighten the display depending on the ambient lighting conditions. Next, we have an important window or part of the main window on the left, which is the frequency that is the active frequency. So this is the in-use or use display showing the active frequency. Next, we have to the right of that, we have the standby frequency window. So this is the frequency that is on standby, and it shows the stored or newly entered frequency. Next, we have the frequency selector knobs. Of course, I'm going to be describing how each of these works in a little bit more detail later on. Next, there is an indicator that shows us when the mic button is depressed for transmission. And this appears in the form of a small lit up capital T in the window where indicated. Below that we have the frequency transfer flip-flop button, which enables us to switch the frequencies between the in-use and on-standby windows, followed by the channel button, which is used for programming purposes. And finally, we have the on-off and volume control switch for radio 1. You can also pull this button out for manual squelch override. So finally, to recap, we have radio 1's active frequency in this image on the screen shown as 118.7 megahertz, and then in terms of the standby frequency for radio 1, what we have showing is 125.8 megahertz. So next we'll be taking a look at radio 2, which is part of the GPS system. The GPS has a number of controls as indicated on your screen, but we'll just be focusing on the specific controls relating to the operation and use of Radio 2. So starting with the power and communication volume or squelch button. So this is the on-off switch for the GPS as well as the volume control for Radio 2. The next button that you need to familiarize yourself with, in the same way that Radio 1 had a frequency flip-flop switch, so does Radio 2. So this is Radio 2's COM frequency flip-flop switch. The next thing to familiarize yourself with is the COM frequency window for Radio 2, which displays both the active and standby frequencies. We'll go into that in a little bit more detail just now. And then we have the enter key, which is used insofar as switching on the GPS so that you can make use of Radio 2 through the switch on sequence. Then we have the frequency tuning knob. There's two parts to this. The larger knob at the base, and that is used to tune the frequency in the megahertz range. And then we have the small inner part of the frequency tuning knob, which is used to tune the frequencies in the kilohertz range. So, as I mentioned just now, this is the on-off switch and the volume control for Radio 2. When you switch the GPS on, the screen that you will initially be seeing is this one here. It shows the name of the particular GPS unit, and then in the bottom right hand corner you'll see the word OK followed by a question mark. When you see that, you can simply press on the enter key, which will then take you to the next screen, and the next screen will look something like this, which itself will also have the word OK with a question mark in the bottom right hand corner. And when you see that appear, you can again simply press on the enter key, and that will take you to the main screen that will be your working screen. So this is what the working screen looks like. As shown here, the GPS is busy acquiring satellites. In fact, it has acquired a number of satellites already. On the screen on the left-hand side, you'll see both the COM and the VLOC set of frequencies being displayed. To note here is more specifically that this is the frequency display window for Radio 2, and this is the overall GPS display window. Insofar as Radio 2 is concerned, the standby frequency is the bottom frequency in the blue highlighted strip. At the moment, this is indicating as 125.6 megahertz. And Radio 2's active frequency is the top frequency, which is currently showing as 124.4 megahertz. The next device we're going to have a look at is the audio control unit. Think of this as the master controller for the two radios. With this unit, you can determine which radio or radios you'll be listening on and which radio you'll be transmitting on. Also, it includes the functionality for the intercom and external music source volume as well. So let's go through the various controls on this unit. The first one is the receiver selector switches. So this is to select which radios you'll be listening on. We then have the transmit selector switch or selector knob, which determines which radio you'll actually be transmitting on. Then you have the ICS or intercom system volume and Vox squelch control knobs, the pilot isolate switch, which is a very useful function, the music volume controller, and the Vox TX annunciator. Now we're going to have a look at the dynamic interaction between these various devices. So how the system operates as a whole. Just to recap, we have the audio controller on top, underneath that radio 1, and underneath that radio 2, which is part of the GPS system. So with the current settings, we're showing the active frequency on radio 1 as 118.7 megahertz, which happens to be Rand Airport. The standby frequency as 125.8 megahertz, which is Joburg West special rules. And for radio 2, the active frequency as 124.4 megahertz, which is Panorama, and standby frequency of 125.6 megahertz, which happens to be Joburg South special rules. So now we're going to see how the audio control unit is used to control what happens on which radios. The first thing we'll start off with is the switches which determine which radios you'll be listening on. So for now, we've got radio 1 set to off, which is a middle position. There are 3 positions on these 3 knobs: a bottom position, a middle position, and a top position. Because on this aircraft we don't necessarily have the equipment fitted which interacts with the switches in the bottom positions, we will only concentrate on those switches in the middle, being the off position, or the up position, which is selecting one of the radios. So we have radio 1 in the off position, we have radio 2 also in the off position, and the TX selector has been set for radio 1 to transmit on 118.7 megahertz. Now, please be aware that the radio that you've selected for transmission will automatically be activated for listening as well. So although radio 1 is shown as listening off, because radio 1 has been selected for transmission, you will in fact also be listening on radio 1. So it is the same as if the switch is in the up position. Personally, I like to have the selector switches corresponding to the radio transmit settings. So if I'm going to be transmitting on radio 1, then I like to keep the listening switch in the up position to show that I'm also listening on radio 1. You don't have to, it's simply a matter of preference. On this screen now, you see radio 1 for listening purposes is set to on, as is radio 2, and radio 1 is still selected for transmission. So in this particular setup, you will be listening out on both radio 1 and radio 2 and transmitting on radio 1. On this screen, what you see is radio 1 being selected in the off position, while radio 2 is in the on position. But as I mentioned earlier on, because radio 1 has been selected for transmit, you will automatically also be listening in on radio 1. So this is a redundant setting. The next scenario we'll look at is what happens when the transmit selector knob is switched to radio 2. So we'll start now with the listening selector switch for radio 1 set to off, for radio 2 set to off as well, and the transmit selector knob set on radio 2. So that would now be set to transmit at 124.4 megahertz. Again, because the radio that has been selected to transmit on is radio 2, by default, you will also be listening on that radio. So the listening switch being in the off position is redundant, and it is the same as if it were in the up position. This would be my preferred setting. So continuing now, we have listening on radio 1 set as on, listening on radio 2 set as off, and radio 2 being selected for transmit on 124.4 megahertz. Because radio 2 has been selected for transmission, the radio 2 listening switch is in a redundant position, and you may as well set it into the up position, which, as I said, would be my preferred setting. Now let's have a look at how we actually tune the 2 radios. So starting with radio 1, first thing to note is that we are talking about the normal operating setting, which would be referred to as frequency mode. There are a number of other modes, I'll get to those in a moment, But for frequency mode, i.e. normal operation, the radio tuning is used to tune the frequency in the standby window using the frequency selection knobs. The larger knob controls changes in increments of 1 megahertz, and the smaller knob controls changes in increments of 50 kilohertz when pushed in and 25 kilohertz when pulled out. So to switch frequencies between the standby and the active frequency display windows on Radio 1, you would simply press the flip-flop switch on that radio. And that changes or swaps around the two frequencies. You can change it back again simply by depressing the flip-flop switch again. As I mentioned, there are a number of different modes for this particular radio. There's frequency mode, which is for normal operation, program mode, which is for programming frequencies for use in the channel mode. Then there's also program secure mode, which is for locking in a desired frequency to a specific channel number. There's a direct tuning mode where you can actually directly tune the frequency in the active frequency display window. And then there's channel mode, which is used to recall previously stored preset frequencies. Now here's a few other useful tips. In addition to the visual cues that you have on your system, simply by looking at the instrument panel, you can see which radio you'll be transmitting on because of the position of the TX knob, either being on Radio 1 or Radio 2. But there are other ways to do a check as well. So in addition to the visual cues that you have on the radio transmission selector knob, as a further visual check to see which radio you're about to listen on, you can briefly press and release the transmit button located on the cyclic control. When you do this though, make sure that you press the transmit button all the way to the second detente position to activate transmission. In this case, one of two things will happen. You'll either see a little T, a little capital T, appear between the in-use and on-standby displays of Radio 1. And of course, if you do see that, it means that you would be transmitting on Radio 1. And in this case, because 118.7 is in the active frequency window display, that's the frequency that you'd be transmitting on. Alternatively, you would then see a little capital TX appear in Radio 2's COM frequency window, and that would confirm to you that you're about to transmit on Radio 2, and consequently the frequency you'd be transmitting on would be 124.4 megahertz. Another useful device is the pilot isolate switch. So let's say that you're flying with a few passengers on board and there's a conversation between the passengers and yourself, but now you wish to either listen out on the radio to an incoming call or make a transmission of your own without hearing the conversation amongst the passengers. To do so, you can simply isolate yourself as the pilot in control by switching the pilot ISO switch to the up position. This way, you will not hear or be disturbed by any of the conversation occurring amongst the passengers over the intercom system. Let's now have a look at the various volume controls on the three devices, the audio controller, Radio 1 and Radio 2. So we'll start with Radio 1. This is Radio 1's volume control button. Note that this is for the incoming communication. So this is for what you'll be hearing over the system. This is the volume control button for Radio 2, which, as I mentioned earlier on, is also the on-off switch of the GPS unit. And here you have the volume control for the intercom system. Simply set each of those to a desired level and a safe level that obviously doesn't hurt your ears, but also allows you to listen to incoming transmissions. So now, by way of wrap up, in this video tutorial, we covered the following. We covered the AA12S series compact audio controller, the Bendix King KY196A VHF communications transceiver, and the Garmin GNS430 GPS unit. Now, please note, as this video was not intended to be a comprehensive operational breakdown of each of these units, please also refer to the operating manual of each of these units for further instructions and information and operating details. Finally, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to watch this video tutorial. I certainly hope it has helped demystify the radio stack on the Robinson R44 Raven 2 for you and will contribute to more enjoyable and confident and safe flying of your aircraft. Thank you.